Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Krista Milich, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and the director of the Reproductive Ecology and Behavioral Endocrinology Laboratory, or REBEL, at Washington University in St. Louis. I am also your professor for this course, The Pandemic, Science and Society. Over the next 3 weeks, we will be immersing ourselves into all things COVID-19. And I know that you may be thinking, I'm immersed enough. And I appreciate that, I understand. But it still remains that there's a lot of misinformation and miscommunication about this pandemic. So we've designed this course to try and help deal with some of that misinformation in the hopes that you can learn about the virus itself and also the ways that it intersects with our society. One thing that I've heard a lot recently is how the message keeps changing. It's hard to know what to believe. Even experts are changing their stories. And as a scientist, that doesn't surprise me at all, because that's how science works. When we are faced with something new, we gather data, we test hypotheses, we challenge our assumptions and our findings, and we try and learn more and more and more. And as we learn that, we try and communicate it to the public. In addition to that, we use what we know about things already, so in this case, other closely related viruses, and we try and apply it to whatever we're dealing with. So if you look at what's happened with this pandemic, you hear changing messages. For example, masks. At first, you heard people saying, unless you're sick, do not wear a mask. And now they're saying, if everyone wore a mask, we could cut down transmission by 80% or more. Wow, it sounds like they don't know what they're talking about, right? But I also can understand why that happened, because keep in mind that at the beginning of this pandemic, we had no idea how common it was for there to be pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic spread of the virus, and now we do. Previously, with viruses that we've had in the United States, they haven't had such a long period of time where people could be infecting others and not even know it. And so based on what we knew about other viruses, based on our previous approaches to public health, we told people, don't wear a mask unless you're sick. And I can understand that as somebody who wears a mask in hot, humid rainforests. Sometimes they're uncomfortable and you really have to resist the urge to touch them all the time. So at first, when we were being told, don't wear a mask, I thought, that seems like a good idea. If a bunch of people who aren't used to wearing masks start wearing them, they'll be touching their faces a bunch, right? And this is a good reminder, don't touch your face when you're out in public. But then we found out how common it was for there to be spread of this virus before there were any symptoms. And so the message had to change to incorporate that information. And that's why you've seen this shift in messaging. For me, that's just how science works. And that's how we can understand some of the changes in messaging that we've had within this pandemic. So what I hope that you'll get from this course is a better understanding about the messages that you've been receiving, knowing which ones that you should listen to and which ones you shouldn't, and just help to clarify some of the confusion around this pandemic. As we go on this journey together, I want to remind you that even though we're all going through this experience, we are not all experiencing it in the same way. This pandemic has exploited existing disparities in our society, and people are dealing with very different issues. I think that you'll realize that as you listen to many of our guest speakers talk. And so it's important that we take that into consideration when we're interacting with each other, when we're interacting with the outside world. We should always be compassionate when dealing with one another and realize that not everyone is having the same experience. I know that there are some of you who may have gotten sick with this virus. There are others of you that may have lost family members or been very worried about family members that were essential workers. Others who don't have a safe place to go home to. And some of you may have experienced racism based on the fact that certain people have pointed at specific places and specific people and blamed them for this virus, despite the fact that it's a global problem, and despite the fact that previous pandemics have arisen in different continents. So I want us all to be thoughtful about our interactions together, and also, hopefully, to think about how we can show each other empathy and have empathy for others around us. I've felt very frustrated at times during this pandemic when I've had to hear people make blanket statements about how we're all going through this experience together. Things like, we'll all be so glad when we finally get out of the house. Meanwhile, there's essential workers that are doing long 12-hour plus shifts away from their home, away from their families. And my guess is that they'll be really looking forward to the time that they can spend at home. I've heard a lot of people talk about all the hobbies that we're all picking up. But for families that are working, parents that are working with children, they're trying to balance full-time childcare with full-time work. And they're making really difficult decisions about how to do that. Going into this fall, some families are faced with questioning if one of the parents will need to quit their job, or if they'll have to risk using childcare outside of the home because they've been left with no good options. So let's be sure that when we're interacting and when we're talking about this experience, we show compassion. This course is meant to give you a good overview into the many different ways that this virus and this pandemic have intersected with our lives. But there's still a lot that we will not be able to cover. So, for example, in the United States, we're going through a census, and that census has been impacted by this virus and the ability to be out. But we're not going to have time to explicitly have a lecture on that. In the United States, we're also at an important moment in history for protesting, for social justice, and protest organizers have been phenomenal at communicating safety standards. But we're not going to have an entire lecture on that either. We're also, importantly, in an election year, and the ability to be able to vote safely is something that we have to be thinking about. We won't have a specific lecture on that, but I hope that all of these things come up in our discussions. If you think about when we first learned about this virus, you'll realize that it's been 9 months now that we've known about it. And so we now are starting to get some understanding of what sort of impacts or lack of impacts the virus may have on pregnant people and on their offspring, as well as maybe breastfeeding. But we're just now starting to get those data. And so it'll still be time before we can really make sense of that. So these are all things that you may be very interested in, I am as well, and that we can hopefully discuss within the context of this class, but we won't have a chance to cover, simply because of time, absolutely every topic that we should be with this pandemic. But I want to point out to you that we have these discussion boards where you can engage with each other. I've also made a list of additional resources. That list could go on and on for pages. So I've just tried to pull a few examples into there. And I hope that you make use of those resources and interact with each other, having discussions about these really important topics, even if we're not able to cover them entirely within this class. Despite there being over 1,200 of you at my last check, we want to try and provide you in some way with a sense of community for this very concerning and very isolating environment of being in a pandemic. So in whatever way we can do that, through this course, through our discussion boards, through our office hours, I hope that you'll let us. On the topic of elections, I wanted to mention that in your syllabus, there's information about how you can register to vote if you're eligible. And I do encourage everyone who is eligible to vote and make your voice heard. Information about how we're handling this pandemic is being dealt with at the local, state, and national level. And so it's important that we think about that when we're voting and try and get leaders who will help us deal with this pandemic. Because importantly, it did not need to be this way, and it does not need to be this way. And I hope that in this class, we can commit to making sure that it is not this way moving forward. I know that some of you are incoming freshmen to WashU, so welcome. We're happy to have you here. I wanted to let you know that this is an intensive course, so I don't want you to think that when you go into the fall semester and you have 4 courses on your schedule, it's going to be the same intensity as this course. Because it's over a shortened time frame, we're going to be meeting 5 days a week for 2 hours a day for 3 weeks straight. You should be engaging with course materials every day. That won't be the case in the fall, so I don't want you to worry about that. But I do hope that you use this time to learn as much as you can and hopefully put into place good practices for when you're going into the fall semester. But I'll talk a little bit more about those logistics later. What I want to do today is start with an introductory lecture to go over some basics, make sure that we're all on the same page. Then I'll introduce you to our teaching team, go over some course logistics, and then answer some questions that you have. In the 2 o'clock hour, we're going to have our first guest, Dr. Julia López from the School of Medicine, who will be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on Spanish-speaking immigrant and Latinx communities. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Except for that the host needs to let me be able to share my screen. One moment, please. Okay, great. Hopefully you're all looking at the course flyer. I have no way to get feedback from you that you are, but I'm going to assume that you are. So as I mentioned in this lecture, I'm going to go over some basics. This will in no way cover everything about the topics that I'm going to talk about. I just want to get us on the same page because from there, speakers will be talking about other topics that will kind of build from what I'm talking about here. So late in 2019, a virus that was novel to humans became known to doctors and scientists. And in early 2020, that virus found itself spreading around the globe and causing several large outbreaks in a variety of countries. By mid-March, a lot of countries were starting to implement safety measures, restricting travel, and putting in place other safety precautions. That virus was SARS-CoV-2. This is not the first novel virus that has threatened human health. It's not even the first virus in recent years. Surely you've heard of Ebola virus, Zika virus, HIV. There's a long list of these. In fact, it's not even the first novel coronavirus to threaten human health in this century. The name SARS-CoV-2 stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And that's because it is genetically similar to a previous coronavirus that also caused a severe acute respiratory syndrome. In 2003, there was the original SARS outbreak of this coronavirus that caused severe acute respiratory syndrome. In addition to these two, we also have a variety of other coronaviruses that can impact humans. Many of these circulate in human populations regularly and cause mild illness. There are also a number of coronaviruses that circulate in non-human animals, and we'll talk about those some throughout this class as well. So why do we end up having these novel viruses emerge? There are a few important factors that we need to keep in mind. One of which, of course, is that we always have to remember the role that evolution plays in introducing novel organisms into our world. And remember that one of the mechanisms that's very important in evolution is mutation. Mutation is the force of evolution that introduces the most novel variation into a population. And so mutation is important when we're dealing with diseases. Take Zika virus, for example. Zika virus was first discovered in the 1940s in Uganda, and it existed in human and non-human primate populations for decades in different parts of Africa and Asia without causing much of a fuss. But then 5 or 6 years ago, it appeared in the Americas and started making people sick. And suddenly it became much more important. Now, what scientists discovered was that there was a mutation that occurred as Zika virus was traveling around the world. And that mutation was associated with these more severe health consequences that we see in the Americas. And so it was for that reason that it became so much more important and serious for human health. So we have to always keep in mind that mutations are important when we're talking about viruses and when we're talking about diseases. In addition to mutation, something that's very important and associated with the increase of emerging infectious diseases is how human activity is changing our planet. We know that habitat destruction, agricultural practices, and climate change are associated with increases in infectious diseases. And I've heard a lot of people say about this pandemic, how could we have ever known this was going to happen? There's no way you could have predicted this, which is fascinating to me because in my world, the sorts of scientific papers that I read, a bunch of people predicted this. Lots of people said there is going to be a novel virus that causes a respiratory illness that will spread very quickly around the world and lead to a pandemic. I mean, at the time that I started preparing this class, I just happened to have multiple papers on my desk that said that exact same thing. They sometimes get a few of the details wrong, like a lot of people predicted that it would originate in Central Africa or in Southeast Asia. But aside from that, in fact, science has been predicting this, that as we continue to expose ourselves to zoonotic diseases through the way we interact with wild places, that we have an increased likelihood of having these sorts of diseases spread and become a danger to human health. And I think one thing that's very important when we think about this type of habitat destruction, agricultural practices, climate change, is to remember that we are not separate from that. Even if these things are occurring in Central Africa or Southeast Asia, it is our consumerism that is driving that pattern. And so it very much is something that we're a part of and that we should be part of a solution to. One other reason that habitat destruction is associated with novel viruses is because, in fact, there are lots of microbes in the world. There are lots of different microbes that exist in wildlife in places that we don't normally interact with it. And it isn't until we come into contact with it through going into those wild places and destroying them and exposing ourselves to the wildlife in them in a very, in a very specific confrontational way that we end up being exposed to those viruses. And so with these reservoirs of disease that exist in wild places, the more that we destroy them, the more that we're exposed to them. So you may recall this glorious tree of life that we all learned about in school, I think, or at least hopefully I'm not dating myself. And it's great, right? There's all these cool animals and plants. It looks really good. Well, it turns out that all of those cool animals and plants actually make up a relatively small proportion of the diversity of life on Earth. And we know that now. Scientists have published the new tree of life, which looks like this. And in fact, all of those cool plants and animals are down here. And what we have are this vast array of microbes, including viruses, that exist throughout the world. Now, some of those are good microbes, right? They provide services to us, to our bodies, to our environment. And other microbes are pathogenic, which means that they can make us sick. That's a horrible oversimplification, and please never tell any microbiologist that I said that. But I feel like for our purposes, we get the idea. So this tree of life is reflecting the organisms that are categorized into different groups. And you may remember that sort of classification from your high school science classes: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I know that some people have really clever ways of remembering that, something about King Philip eating spaghetti. I can never remember what that is, so I just remember the actual classification system. So I want to talk about where we fit coronavirus in this classification scheme, because it's really important, right? As I mentioned earlier, we're using what we know about closely related viruses to try and figure out this new virus. And so it's important that we understand where it fits. So if we're thinking about those categories of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we can look at how we classify humans just to orient ourselves to this classification system. So in this recent publication, they give these classifications for coronavirus next to classifications for humans. Humans are in the order primates, so you can see that there. And then you can go down through our family, genus, and species. So next to this, we have the Organization for Coronavirus. And I'm showing you this because some of our other speakers will be talking to you about, for example, other RNA viruses and how we can use what we know about those to understand the current outbreak. If you look down at the bottom of the coronavirus column, you'll see that there's a number of different coronaviruses there, including ones that have some names associated with other animals, like a bat and a civet. As I mentioned, the coronaviruses that impact humans are not the only coronaviruses. And we need to be able to place into context how this new virus is related to these other viruses to try and understand where it falls in this classification system. So another way to look at this is, you may remember your old friend, the phylogenetic tree, and you can place within this tree of known viruses like MERS and the original SARS-CoV-2. And then you can begin to start to understand how that is related to the other viruses that we know, and hopefully start to get some ideas of how we can deal with this current pandemic. So this virus, SARS-CoV-2, causes a disease. As I mentioned, some microbes are good, some are pathogenic. So SARS-CoV-2 is a pathogen that causes a disease, and that disease is called COVID-19. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, the 2 was because it was the second of its kind, right? And despite what you may have heard on TV, the 19 in COVID is not because it's the 19th disease of its kind. Instead, it's because, as mentioned earlier, this was first described in 2019. So COVID-19 stands for coronavirus disease 2019. So that's the disease that we're dealing with. And we want to be thinking about what we can do to try and control this disease. Right now, our best approaches to dealing with it, our best medical interventions, are actually our own personal behaviors. So we need to be thinking about how we are behaving ourselves in order to try and make sure that we're doing our best to prevent the spread of this disease. That means that if you're able to, wear a mask. There's an asterisk there because we should be aware, of course, that not everyone is able to wear a mask. But if you can, wear a mask. Keep your distance. Probably more distance than I'm keeping here from this monkey, but keep your distance. And wash your hands. Wash your hands regularly and thoroughly. It also means, unfortunately, that we have to change some of our behaviors. You have to be cautious about the types of things that you're doing, and you need to not engage in any unnecessary activities. And I know that's not fun, and we don't like that, but that's the truth. The only way that we get out of this is if we actually act in a way that helps us to. So we need to avoid these unnecessary behaviors. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to isolate yourself, nor do we want you to. This is my dog, Amblehead. She was forced into this crate today specifically to take this picture for this lecture. And as you can see from the look on her face, she is not pleased with it. She doesn't advocate for isolating yourself, nor do I. It's important that you find ways to safely interact with other people. So this is not the solution. Don't isolate yourself. Instead, we want you to be thinking about how you, like Amblehead, can be living your best life, putting on your lion costume, biting into the head of a unicorn. But right now, that does not mean you can do whatever you want to do. Unfortunately, we do have to miss out on some of the things that we would otherwise do. That is the only conscientious way to move forward. It pains me a lot to see so many people that are just going back to life as usual, or going back to life just like slightly differently, because we aren't in a place where we can do that right now. And so these people are doing that while other people are suffering a lot. We have to make difficult decisions about how to minimize these unnecessary activities for the good of everyone. Now, again, you can still find ways to enjoy your time, like Amblehead here. Probably you have different ways than Amblehead to enjoy your time, but it means thinking carefully about your actions, and also, importantly, talking to others and taking into consideration what you have to do to be safe. And I really want to advocate, particularly for those of you coming back to campus or starting to engage with other people, that you have difficult conversations about how you are going to be safe in doing that. Communicating about what precautions you are going to take is so important. Here you can see Amblehead with my nephew Joseph planning out their adventure outside. Maybe they'll go outside, but they need to discuss a plan. All ages are failing miserably at this communication. It's awkward. It feels weird to talk to each other about, if we get together, how far away are we going to stay? Are we going to go inside or stay outside? Will we wear masks or not wear masks? Can we take off our masks and put our faces together so we can take a picture since we haven't seen each other for so long? There's all sorts of things that feel really awkward to talk about, but that you must talk about before you get together. Part of what I want to do with this course is normalize those sorts of discussions and keep them normalized here at WashU so that we have the opportunity to enjoy our time and at the same time can stay safe. This course will hopefully give you the knowledge you need to do so, a network, a huge network of other people on campus who are like-minded, and lots of information about the real world significance of your actions. So let's talk a little bit about the course, starting with the teaching team. I also want to mention that you can find out a lot of information about all of us on Canvas, and I encourage you to familiarize yourself with Canvas and stay up to date. Canvas is really going to be your go-to place these next 3 weeks. In addition to the people that I'll be telling you about today, who will be holding office hours and who you'll have the opportunity to interact with one-on-one, we have a great team of people behind the scenes that are helping us with all the technology issues and content. And they've built a really amazing Canvas site for you, so I hope you take advantage of it. So I'm gonna go ahead and start by telling you a little bit about my research. I think, yes, okay. So I study how the environment, both the social and physical environment, impacts individuals, including their behaviors, their physiology, their health. A lot of my work involves hormones. I also specialize in understanding sexual selection and reproductive ecology, but those things require that I understand a lot more than just that, right? Thinking about different aspects of health, different aspects of diseases, and how they impact an individual's behaviors, their physiology, and so on. Since 2007, I've been working in Uganda in a place called Kibale National Park, where I study this cute little animal, the red colobus monkey. Some of you may be familiar with it because it's the favorite meat of chimpanzees. So if you ever see a video of a chimpanzee hunting, it's likely a red colobus that it's hunting, not always, but likely. So I study these in a forest with, of course, chimpanzees that hunt them, as well as a bunch of other primates and other animals like elephants. There are actually 13 species of non-human primates that live in this forest. And it's a big forest, but comparatively to the Amazon, for example, it's a small forest, and it's surrounded by people. So those people have interactions with all of these non-human primates. Like, for example, this baboon who stole this banana from someone. That someone happened to be me, and he stole an entire bunch of bananas from me and then went and sat like 10 feet away from my house and just stared at me and ate the entire bunch of bananas. So you have these really close interactions between wildlife and people, and that's how you get zoonotic disease transmission, right? You have these close interactions where you have the chance for diseases to be exchanged. So as part of my work, even though I largely focus on being in the forest and studying non-human primates, I also work with the communities there. And we've been working on a series of land use changes along the boundary of the park so that we can try and stop these interactions, stop these potential disease spreading events by keeping the animals in the forest, and the people in their lands. So that's my work in Uganda. I do a lot of other projects, but I'm just gonna touch a little bit on my work in the Amazon also, but feel free to go to my website or check out my research and contact me if you have any interest in it. So another project that I do is working in the Amazon with spider monkeys and woolly monkeys, trying to understand physiological correlates of male social behavior. And then once I started my work on Zika virus, I used this as one of the locations where we were collecting samples. So I have a project looking for reservoirs of Zika virus in the Americas. And what this means is that we're trying to see what non-human primates may be carriers of Zika virus that could be reservoirs of the disease and then transfer it back into humans at different points. Zika virus is very closely related to dengue fever and also yellow fever. So these are diseases that we know non-human primates can carry. Some non-human primates even have major die-offs because of yellow fever. So it's a very serious virus for them also. But that cycle creates a concern for human health. So just like I was talking about this novel coronavirus and how we're looking to closely related viruses to try and understand it, we do the same thing all the time in science, right? And that's the basis of my work with Zika virus. So I collected samples from a variety of locations in Brazil and Mexico, this site in Ecuador, as well as got samples from Colombia. And we're going to be screening those to try and see what species and in what locations non-human primates may be reservoirs of Zika virus. In addition to me, we have a massive teaching team, which is really wonderful and it'll be great for all of you. Leading that team is Dr. Horace. She has her PhD and recently joined our department less than a year ago, I think. And she also studies non-human primates. So she's going to be available to help you with a lot of the course logistics and other questions that you have. And then we have 16 graduate students from the Department of Anthropology. All of the information about them can be found on Canvas. You can also look at the Department of Anthropology website to learn more about them. I'll just briefly go through them, but I want you to be aware that these are graduate students who range in subdiscipline from archaeology, biological anthropology, and sociocultural anthropology. They all have really interesting research areas, and so I encourage you to check out their work as well. We have Christina and Bridget, as well as Lucy, Yegan, Rachel Kuzma. There's 2 Rachels, so it's worth noting. Catherine, Annika, and Eva, as well as Zealous, Alex, and Luisa. Suwasu, Jake, and Rachel Sender. That's Rachel number 2. And then we still need to get a bio up, but we also have Sarah. So all of these people will be available to you. We'll be posting the schedule of their office hours, but fortunately, because there's so many of us, it's hard to find a time in the day when you won't find someone in office hours that you can talk to. So I want to go over just a few logistics from the syllabus, and then I will take some questions. Taking questions is going to be a normal part of all of our lectures. And then after I take those questions, then we will go into the second hour where we'll be talking to Dr. López. Okay, so on the Canvas site, you can find everything that you need about the syllabus and also the requirements, due dates, those sorts of things. I'll just briefly touch on a few things that people have been asking a lot. There are very short reading assignments. They're not always reading. Sometimes they're podcasts or videos that you should try and check out before class each day. But if you miss them, just try and catch up after class. There are also assignments that you need to keep up on. The way I organize the assignments is that I've given you long periods of time for you to complete any given assignment. I'm doing that because we're in the middle of a pandemic and I don't know what all of you are dealing with. So I want you to have a lot of flexibility. But with that said, you're going to be most successful in this course if you keep up with those requirements on a daily basis. For example, one of the assignments that you have is completing almost daily comprehension quizzes. It will be much easier to complete a 10-question multiple choice quiz right after you've sat through the lecture than it will be to go back to it 4 days later and try and remember what that lecture was about when you just had 4 other lectures that you sat through. So try and keep up with that, but also know that we understand this is a difficult time and we're happy to be flexible given that it's such a difficult time. Okay, so the other I'll just jump to assignments really quickly. An assignment that you need to get done first is an introductory survey. We just want to make sure we know any concerns that you have. Then in addition to those comprehension quizzes, there's 12 of them, so they're not actually every day, but they're most days. You will have these public communication assignments. The idea there is that you're taking what you learn in this class and you're helping to communicate it to the rest of the world. We're in a situation where people are making individual decisions for what is really a collective action problem, right? So as much as we can try and disseminate good information, the better off we'll be. And this is a great skill for you to learn. So we're going to have several lectures this week that relate to science communication and health communication. And then over the course of the next 3 weeks, you'll have to turn in 4 total public communication assignments. 2 of these are super easy. Something basic like take a fact that you learned and tweet it. If any of you use Twitter, I've been told that's like a very old person thing. So do whatever you do with it, that fact. Or for the other 2, you need something more involved. It could be creating a visual about information that you learned. It could be writing a longer piece. Maybe you submit a letter to your editor of your local newspaper. You could do a lot of different things. And then on Canvas, you're going to provide us with a picture or a screenshot of that public communication that you attempted so that we can see that you're trying. So those are the assignments, and at the end you'll have a short reflection piece, and all of that is outlined on the Canvas site and also in the syllabus. So something that is not part of the graded assignments, but that we do encourage you to use are the discussion boards, which I think I've mentioned multiple times already. That's really where we're trying to build a community. And so even if there's a topic that you want to engage with people on and we don't have a specific discussion board for it, but you feel like that conversation is really taking off, let us know. We'll create a discussion board, and then you can have a lot of people comment on it and look at the community that you'll be building at WashU. Okay, going back up to the asynchronous participation, there are some of you that have time conflicts consistently with this course. If you are a person that has a real time conflict every day of this course, you can take this class asynchronously. That means that you should contact us, let us know that you're taking it asynchronously. And I should verify, when I say contact us, we have a specific email for this course. I encourage you to always contact that email because that email is being regularly monitored. And so you'll get feedback faster if you contact that email address. It's on the Canvas site, it's on the syllabus for any concerns you have about the course. So you contact us, we'll talk to you about what you need to do. If you just need to miss a day of class or 3 days or 4 days, you don't need to contact us and you don't need to do anything extra. This is an amazing opportunity for all of you to get to interact with these 28 brilliant experts that we've lined up for this course. So I encourage you all to participate as much as you can synchronously, but I acknowledge that that's not always possible. For some of you, it will never be possible, and I think you'll still benefit from hearing the recordings of those lectures. But for those of you who don't have specific conflicts and can try and participate as much as possible synchronously, I encourage you to do that. And with notes, probably should have said this at the beginning of this lecture, we are not expecting you to remember all of the details that are covered in this class. That's not the point at all. We're looking at big picture. We want you to take home the big messages that are really going to help us deal with the public health crisis that we are facing right now. So don't worry about writing down absolutely everything you hear. Write down the big picture items, maybe a few quotes that you want to use in your public communication pieces, but don't try and scramble and get everything written down. If you do miss something, you want to be able to go back and look at it. We're recording these sessions so that you can access them in Canvas. Okay, so we have a few minutes left and I want to use this time to answer any questions. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and look at the questions. So there's a question about if information covered today will be included on the quiz. So the quiz is not today, it's tomorrow. And so I would say on the rare occasion when there's not a quiz for a certain day and it's the next day, you can assume that there may be a question or two from the previous day's lectures. Again, these are big picture sort of things. So seems like you were here in this lecture, and therefore will be prepared to answer those questions. PowerPoints are not being posted anywhere because we are sharing the recordings with you, and importantly, a lot of the PowerPoints that will happen in this class are going to be from guest speakers, and we don't always have access to those slides. So there are a lot of questions that I'm going to try. There are some questions about specifics about SARS as SARS compared to SARS-CoV-2, and some specific questions about the virus. I'm going to recommend that we hold those types of questions for some of our other speakers, simply because I think right now it's the first day of class and a lot of students are concerned about logistics. So I want to get those covered, but I will tell you that tomorrow we have Dr. David Wang, who's going to be talking to us first, and he is the perfect person to ask those questions to. What are some conditions that prevent individuals from wearing a mask? Actually, great question and good plug for later in this semester when we're going to have a lecture on ableism and disability, where we'll get to hear about some of those specific conditions that make it difficult for people to wear a mask. Okay. Have primates spread viruses to humans before? I know I said I was only going to take logistical questions, but I will say yes, much more than you know. HIV is a disease that non-human primates spread to humans. That's a really big one, but there are many more than that, but I'll at least lead you with that tidbit. Do I have a favorite monkey? I'm gonna look for a logistical question because that one is just too hard. There's no good answer. For the comprehension quizzes, you get one try. Again, these are quizzes that if you are paying attention during these lectures, you will do a great job on them. So just make sure that you're showing up every day, paying attention, getting the main points, learning the stuff we're telling you about, and then you'll do wonderful on those quizzes. I don't want you to stress too much about that. If you don't pay attention during the lectures, you likely will not do well on the quizzes. And even if you get lucky on a few and do okay, I would say it's not a sustainable practice, so I would not recommend it. Do we get participation points for the discussion board? There is no specific tally of discussion board participation points, but I would say that if you're the type of person that doesn't feel comfortable ever during the time period that we have in this synchronous session to ask a question of your speakers, then you may want to engage instead on the discussion board. What we want to see is that students are engaging in some way with this course, and there are different options for how you do that. It could be asking questions of speakers, it could be participating in the discussion board, but we won't be tallying up the line by line amount that you're participating in discussion boards. Okay, there's a question about, during my research, did I find that any particular species of monkey had a higher chance to be a viral reservoir, or did any species carry a significantly higher viral load? Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. There's variation in this, and it also depends, it depends on the virus, and it depends on the species of monkey. And it also depends on what the concern is, right? So relatedness to humans is one thing that impacts how concerned we are about different viral loads in species. There are currently 118 questions, so I'm going to continue looking for some logistical ones. If you want to take the class pass-fail, there is the option to do that in WebStack or wherever you register for the class. You have the option of doing it for credit, which is for a grade, pass-fail, or to audit it. If you're auditing, just show up to these lectures, watch them, pay attention. That's all you have to do. If you are taking the class for a grade or pass-fail, then you need to do all of the assignments as well as show up for these lectures. But I do want to point out one thing. I found it very useful in the spring for students to have until the last day of class to decide if they were going to take the class pass-fail or for a grade. And so I requested that that be the situation for this class. And so students have until the last day of this class to choose if they want it to be pass-fail or taken for a grade. And all of that information, again, can be found in the syllabus and on Canvas. Sorry. So, okay. So for viewing lectures asynchronously, will we be able to see the questions answered? So all of the questions that get answered will be either this, rarely it will be this, me reading the questions and answering them. More often it's gonna be me asking the questions to our guest and them responding. All of that will be part of what is recorded so that you can get those answers as well. Some of you are definitely not going to be able to get your questions answered because there are so many and we're running out of time. But if you have, I would encourage you to look over the syllabus, look over Canvas. There's also frequently asked questions on Canvas, and we can populate some of what we see here on that frequently asked questions page on Canvas. So please look that over because I'm seeing a lot of questions that will be answered in those two areas. The quizzes are multiple choice. And there's a question about where you find the public communication assignments. Those are on Canvas. And if that material has not already been made available to students, it certainly will be by the end of today. For note-taking during the lectures, again, just really focus on those big picture questions. The quizzes are open note. Yes, you're able to use any notes or anything else that you need when you're doing those quizzes. So again, we have 160 questions right now. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to get to all of those. And I definitely don't want to cut short any time with our guest speaker. But I'm really excited that everyone is so engaged and enthusiastic about the class that we're getting this many questions. And so I think keep up that spirit, you know, engage on Canvas and that'll help get some of this sorted out as well. I'll also just point out that Canvas, the Zoom calls, all of these things, they had to be put together pretty quickly because obviously this is a ever-shifting situation and we had no idea how many people would be interested in this class. We're thrilled about it. Of course, we want you all here, but also that means that over these next couple days, we're gonna be trying our best to catch up on getting you all the information that you need. Okay, so with that, it is 2 o'clock and I want to introduce our first speaker for this entire course. Very excited to have her. Dr. Julia López from Washington University School of Medicine. So Dr. López, I think that people should be able to see you. Do you want to say hello? Oh, you cannot. Megan, could you please give Dr. López permission? Oh, we can't hear you. Is your sound working?
Okay, here we go. Yes, thank you for giving me the option to unmute myself. I was like, oh no. Yes, very exciting to be here. Very exciting to hear about the kind of the course getting itself so popular, and the great lineup of lecturers I think is going to be really fascinating and very exciting. So yeah, just to kind of start off, my name is Dr. Julia López. I am at the School of Medicine at Washington University, and I actually work in the Division of Infectious Diseases. I actually was recruited there in February before I was at in obstetrics and gynecology, working in women's health. So I've been at WashU for about 5 years now, and I've done a lot of different types of work, a lot of epidemiological work, but my clinical background is in social work, so I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. So I do a lot of work in the community, grassroots organizing, and collaborations. So I'm very much a person who's interested in being on the ground and not stuck in a building somewhere looking at a computer. So I really do love that part of my job. I think that it does really bring in another level of understanding when it comes to looking at research. I think sometimes when we have our brains always focused on research, we kind of forget about the individual, stories and characteristics of people and their resiliency in the way that they're able to function and work when there are already difficult things happening in their lives, and then you add on a very thick layer of the pandemic. And I think that you get a lot of resilience and stories out of that. And so I think for me, it's really important to capture the research part of it and understanding how do we extrapolate these individual kind of stories, and how do we make it, understanding it from a larger perspective, as well as being able to understand like what is it that people need when it comes to access to care and things of that nature. Specifically, my work has always been in in immigrant or and or Latin specific kind of health disparities, racial disparities, as well as people with persistent and severe mental illness and substance use. So I have kind of I guess you could say like a hodgepodge of things that I have kind of come together over my last 18 years of doing variations of clinical work and in addition to research. With now my niche being the Latin immigrant population, but also part of my recruitment to infectious diseases was to also have a focus on sexual and gender minority individuals, so LGBTQIA kind of work. So I'm really excited. Krista, reached out because I was on a panelist discussion talking about COVID immigrant health in the St. Louis area specific to the Latin community. And, I think that I guess I made an impression a bit, to be able to have a conversation about some of these things. So, yeah, Krista, you can't unmute yourself. Okay, cool. I can do a screen share. It's a pretty low key, just a few slides. So Krista, you're unmuted. So would you like me to do that now, or would you like to ask a couple questions before?
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
now
great.
I can.
Great. Thank you for being the first while we've been
Yeah, no problem.
As you saw, I was frantically like, someone please help me, I can't unmute myself. Okay, great. So everything you said was amazing. And I want to just kind of dive into some of that in a little more detail. And so please feel free to share the slides at whatever point in this it makes sense. So you obviously talked about the type of work that you do and the type of work that you want to do and how you got into it. I guess I'm wondering if you could also just give us a little bit more information about like the specific types of communities that you work with, and right before this pandemic, what was your day-to-day kind of looking at compared to how it's looking now?
Right, absolutely. So, I would say like my niche focus has always been sexual health. And I guess like the groups of people that I have, intertwined with, that I also identify as, has varied, I guess, over the years, but it has always been this sexual health connected to mental health and substance use. Like what about our sexual health? How does that influence our mental health, and vice versa? When we feel comfortable and safe, how likely are we to engage in, X variations of sexual health? And so I always talk to my students, when I'm teaching class, which I teach variations of classes. Some are clinical based, like I teach a trauma-informed type of modality for therapy. Another one that I teach is politics and policy and advocacy work, right? So from a macro level. But one thing that I always say is that all of the things that I've ever talked about always has to do something with sex. So like, I'm always having a conversation about like, why is it that we do the things we do, or why is it that we don't? And so I'm a very big advocate when it comes to this understanding of how do you identify yourself in relation to society, how society decides to identify you, even if you don't agree with what they're saying about you. And then how does that influence then your behaviors, or what you end up thinking about yourself, or how you decide the social structures of the people around you are influencing the way you think or feel? Because unfortunately, one could say that social pressures doesn't matter, but at the very core, they do to some degree, sometimes more influential than others. And I think we see that very often in COVID right now, like how much of a nasty look do you get if you don't wear a mask, versus not, like these kinds of things that influence. And then I talk to my clients every day about, oh, I felt really uncomfortable here, a lot of communication or lack of communication, what does feel comfortable and what is a comfortable space for me. That kind of conversation has been had for, ever, because we're talking about comfortability about the body in relation to other people's bodies. But now we're just talking about it in this context of COVID, when, we're having conversations like that in so many other arenas. Right before COVID started, the pandemic, and everything shifting and changing, my day-to-day work was really about building in like grassroots community engagement type of work. I have always been, and I continue to be, like really interested in talking to service providers and community workers, as well as participants and kind of patients to those services, being able to understand what is it that you feel is missing, what do you think would make life easier. And that's all in the context, in the bubble of health, when you're talking about your physical health, but then also for me, with my focus of mental health. And unfortunately, for me, I think a lot of the folks that I have worked with and the identities that I identify with have had a lot of trauma that have been experienced, not only from interpersonal relationships, but also from structural, isms that I think also influence how you experience life, and then how much of that is traumatic. So in the panelist discussion that I was a part of, I talked a lot about structural racism, how structural racism is something that you cannot, not talk about when you're talking about traumatic events, because a lot of times it has to do with race. It has to do with ethnicity. It has to do with, are you monolingual or bilingual or not? It has to do with what you know and how much you know, and that is all going to influence what kinds of access you're going to have and the kind of respect you're going to get while trying to access that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the current pandemic? How has the pandemic kind of exploited or exacerbated those challenges and disparities that already exist?
Absolutely. So there's actually just like probably a couple weeks ago, a publication out from the Annals of Epidemiology that talked specific to Latin population and the disproportionate effects of COVID. And so some of the things that we know, is that generally speaking, Latinx population is 18% of the US population. So that's just kind of the general statistic, right? Among confirmed COVID cases, which we know is like not the whole, picture, of course, Latinx make up 33% of those cases. And that's of confirmed, and then also that we know what race or ethnicity they picked, right? Because there's actually we all know that there's actually about 50% of COVID cases that the information about their race and ethnicity has not been clarified. So, this is all related to what we know or what's been confirmed. When we talk about hospitalization rates, Latinx and non-Latinx Black persons are four to 5 times more likely to be hospitalized than the non-Latinx white persons for COVID-related specific reasons. 1 in 5 confirmed COVID cases, death-related cases, are among Latinx individuals. So we're talking a lot about disproportion, and then we're talking about, well, why is that, right? And that kind of goes back to your question, Krista, like, why is it that we're having seeing these things? And are we really so shocked, people who've worked in health disparities or racial disparities kind of work? No, unfortunately, I mean, we're not, right? But that we're seeing it to such a extreme or to a dynamic really does highlight the level of structural racism, structural inequities that are in place that really make these numbers the way that they are and currently trending. So what do these kinds of things look like? First and foremost, when we think about what the types of work we're thinking about as it relates to Latin folks, and especially Latin immigrants, both documented and undocumented, In the Midwest, the proportion of those who have been infected and who have confirmed cases is higher than just the general proportion of those who are held in the Midwest, which the Midwest is considered like Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, North Dakota, South Dakota. Like the CDC actually has a map where it decides like what is Midwest, Northeast, et cetera. So you could look that up if you wanted to just get an idea. But what do we know about, you know, kind of what sits in the Midwest is there's going to be large poultry, meatpacking industries. Who hold, you know, a lot of those jobs? It is the Latin immigrants who do. And so what's happening is that depending on the job that you have, and because the presidential administration had meatpacking and poultry and all of that as essential workers, right? Here we are now with a really, you know, impacted population who is also, you know, who are also a large proportion of those who are working in those industries. And so you have that culmination of, well, this is where I already work, this is where I'm at, and then there's also a pandemic happening. But if I'm going home and I'm an undocumented immigrant, I also don't have access to the same healthcare as I would somebody else. So we even have to think about disparities even as it relates to those who are documented versus undocumented. I, as a first generation immigrant, have privileges as a documented person that, you know, my family, you know, over here doesn't. And so what does that do as it relates to illness, progression of illness? We know that people who don't have access, who don't have the funds to do so, are going to wait a lot longer, become really sick until they can't move. And so they're going to go in and get help then. But is that progression gone too far, right? And probably so in a lot of situations, unfortunately. So we're talking not only, you know, what are you already in, you know, experiencing as your just personal health, but what are the structures in place? If I'm working in a place that also is not, you know, that's really hard to do social distancing in, like a meatpacking place, that's not like many people I have had conversations with who've worked in such industries talk about, like, it's very close. Everything is very close. Everything is closed, right? You don't have a lot of like movement. And so what's the likelihood of getting infected there? You have also the sheer access of health insurance. Who is capable of getting the health insurance and who's not? Then you have to think about, well, what's available around the area? If people are living in more rural areas, how is that going to impact their ability to get those services, right? And then you think, well, then it's like, well, there may be something there, but they don't have a Spanish speaking, you know, person there, or they don't have translation services readily available. It takes a few days. A few days makes a big difference for someone. If you're trying to engage someone in care, and this is very much an HIV standpoint, because I do a lot of work in HIV, is like, you want to do the engagement then. Somebody says, I'm interested, you need to do that engagement right then, because loss to follow-up is so, so high. It's the same perspective here. Loss to follow-up is going to be high because people have other kinds of impacts that they're going to have to deal with. What am I going to do with my family? I have to go back to work. How are we going to pay those bills? You know, like, and thinking I can't be here waiting for someone to help me with my health when there's very large implications if I don't go back to work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all of those things are so important, right? We talked a little bit before this meeting, and you're bringing up things that I hadn't even thought of that I have on my list of things to ask you. And, you know, we, in the first hour of this, I was saying how we all have to acknowledge our role in these things, because even if we're actually pretty comfortable, some of us, you know, sitting at home and eating whatever we want to eat and whatnot, that's coming from somewhere, and we play a role in that consumerism chain, and we need to be thinking about the people who don't have that privilege right now. So I guess one thing I'm wondering is how, given all of this, how has your work shifted to deal with these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. It's shifted quite a bit, to be honest. And I mean, I think I'm very lucky to be able to have shifted my work in such a way, because I think that, you know, again, like recognizing what kinds of privileges one holds, especially in the type of work that they have, that a shift is even capable, like is even available to happen, I think is really indicative of a lot of things, right? And so for me, the shift has been really kind of doing more of the, okay, on the ground kind of stuff. So for example, something that came out of this, especially in St. Louis, was that there's all this information being posted about COVID and, you know, what you should do and all of these things, but there was like a huge lag in any like translation of any of that content. The closest you could get was from the CDC. And even then the CDC took a little while to like post some stuff in Spanish even, right? So, and so then one thing that came out of that was a grassroots movement called STL Juntos. Juntos means together. And so is two women, Gabriela and Lourdes. And so they both just started literally like taking that content, translating it, posting it, putting a Facebook group together, and it's just grown in such an exponential way because people are able to gain the resources that they otherwise wouldn't know where to get, or, you know, or it wasn't available. Filling that gap between March to, I'd say like May or June, where there was quite the lag in being able to provide the types of information that people were really needing in the area, both not only in the city of St. Louis, but also the county and the region, which is, you know, a large one at that. And so I think for me, I got connected with them and we started doing a lot of mental health focused kind of things. So first it just was like, oh, we're just going to do like, how are people feeling kind of thing, which now has turned into a bi-weekly like mental health group that we do that's live on Facebook, that people interject questions, that we have people who are on Zoom asking questions. And each time I think, well, I'm wondering if people are still interested in this, right? Like I'm always going to be interested in mental health. Like I will always be interested in mental health, but like maybe other people will start to feel like, is this really benefiting me? And every single time there are so many comments about, I'm so glad that this is still happening. I feel so alone sometimes. I'm glad I'm not the only one who thinks about this. You know, we had a whole conversation about school, right? And school starting and the anxiety surrounding school and what that would mean and how that was going to impact people. Not only because what do you do if you're a one parent household and your kids are not going to go to school, but how do you function with that? But also thinking it from a Latin perspective of, well, maybe I know enough English to get through the work that I need to do, but how am I going to actually make the connection for the teaching materials that my child is going to have so that they can be appropriately getting the kind of content they need? And that was a whole topic all on its own. Like, how do you do that? Oh, sure, you would get tutoring services maybe, but are tutoring services available? What happens if you don't have the resources to get the tutoring services? I imagine each school district is different, right? These kinds of things that we're never, you know, we aren't prepared for. And that, you know, again, puts in very sharp focus the sheer disparity that happens when people who have access, may it be that English is their first language, or that they have the economic gains to have a tutor, or they have the flexibility to work from home. You know, that there are all these things that do play a huge impact that we can't negate, and that's going to force people to make decisions that they would otherwise not do, you know, if they could have the option.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, that's not where they're left to do. They're kind of left at the corner, and they got to make that decision to do it. And then that puts them at higher and higher risk every single time they leave the house.
Exactly. I mean, I was saying earlier, you know, we have to treat each other with compassion because people are being forced to make decisions that are really difficult and are not ideal. And I think it's amazing. I mean, with all the bad things that have come out of this, I do think that some of the work, like you were mentioning, the grassroots organizing and coming up with a solution, it's so wonderful to see that. And, you know, that's the reality, is that we do have the capacity to do that good. And so I just want to see that happening at a bigger and bigger scale. You know, I think with your work, some of the specific places that have come up in the news a lot as being a concern for immigrant communities. You know, for the past several years, we've had this crisis at the border. Can you speak at all to the conditions of what's happening at the border? Are there any safety measures in place at detention centers that are holding a large amount of adults and children what's happening with that?
Yeah, so I actually, I have yet to be, I've gone to a detention center early on in my career, but I haven't been back to one yet. Although my aim is to actually volunteer back again, like I did before, at probably Dilley, which is on the border in Texas. And so, one of the things that what happened most recently was a complete kind of evaluation of the detention centers, how they were handling things as it related to COVID specific stuff. And so, something that came out and made top news there for a minute was about kind of the sheer lack of appropriate care that was needing to happen for those who were being detained. And so that was a really, again, like, for being a social worker and like really thinking about people's resiliency, like I also have a pretty cynical, pessimistic side of myself, and that, I unfortunately was not shocked, right? Like that this is what we're talking about when we're talking about caging children and families, because that's exactly what that is. And I, don't hold myself back to that. So I think that it's really important to note that yes, there are so many things happening already, even before COVID, that was completely inappropriate, tearing people, families, and young children. Talk about trauma, the traumatic events that will then ensue thereafter, and the influence of that in the people's like developmental trauma in their lives. I think is far-reaching and is really, I don't think anybody has a true understanding of like the sheer impact that will have. Then you turn, you think about COVID and people who, were talking about COVID, and there were so many things that were happening all at the same time, people trying to get focused on what to do, how to do it, where we're going to go, and some of the things that were getting left behind, although key people who were in that work, were trying to bring it to the surface, was those who are in detention centers and those who are in jails and prisons. What about the, criminal justice system, and what about those folks there? And thinking about what is the impact of how you're going to handle COVID in a place where, crowding is the name of the game. Like that is exactly the problem that we have all of the time. That has been a problem for a long time, especially in the criminal justice system. And so I think that what I have captured from other colleagues and things of that nature is that things are abysmal. They're not where they need to be. And there was, though, a recent federal circuit judge, I think, that did an overturning of some sorts to be able to release, that said that the children need to be released back to a caregiver. That still is in limbo. I've been trying to figure out and follow up where that is, because how does that play out logistically? We see all of these things, and I can appreciate like, we're trying to reunite, but then the logistics of actually getting that to happen, like how, how does that fall in line, or how are we making that even feasible for the families in the first place? And I think that, there are also missing a really strong chance in being able to truly, reunite families in the way that they need to be. And so I think that there continues to be issues at the border for sure. I think that that also falls close in line with the criminal justice system in general, and how there's been just a general lack of focus to that population. Again, if that's not your focus, right? If that's what you work in all the time, it's like all you think about. But yeah. I think that it's totally been missed out on a grander scale. Like when you read the news or with things that pop up to you, they like reach out every once in a while, but they are not the like key thing that's ever discussed, right? Unless you like go digging.
Yeah, we're actually going to have a lecture on that later. We have two formerly incarcerated people that will be talking to us about the challenges of COVID, and they're still connected to people that are currently incarcerated. So I had tried to find out if there was a way I could interview someone who was currently incarcerated, but that was a no. So hopefully we'll get a lot of good information from that, because I agree. I think, one of the things that we're trying to do in this course is talk about these issues that are not getting enough attention and are so important. And I think also in learning about them then changes how we approach the issue, right? Suddenly your own personal pleasure seems like not as important when you consider how much other people are going through. And so finding ways to kind of manage both and get through this very difficult time while also being considerate of others. So I think this is extremely helpful. I want to ask another question specifically about immigrant communities, because you mentioned how difficult it is to kind of make sure that there's a time flow to getting the care that's needed and not having a break in that. Which is difficult even for legal immigrants, but there are some undocumented, there's a lot of undocumented immigrants, right, that are at risk and vulnerable. And so what happens there, I imagine that's even more complicated, having access to healthcare or even being able to report if you have symptoms or anything.
Yes, definitely. I think it does pose in its own entirety a very huge barrier. Thankfully, you have some really focused organizations in varying areas. Obviously, my focus, like what I know, is in the St. Louis space. But, you think about what kinds of organizations are already about and what are they doing and how are they actually doing that outreach, doing those grassroots movement, collecting and connecting with other strong entities in the area, and how are they trying to really bring that together. You add that with STL Juntos, who's also doing like stuff on the ground, as well as the social media platform communication piece and translation piece and all of that kind of educational content, as well as like really tangible, resourceful things like come Tuesdays and Thursdays at this location and we will give you food for your children. Period. Like we just need to be able to give you your basic needs, right? This goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You can't talk about someone's, trauma. You can't talk about someone's, this, that, and the other if they're, unhoused, right? Like there's really no purpose, because what we're talking about here is the priority of someone to be somewhere safe and to have a roof over their head. And we can't be talking about anything else outside of that, because the person's not going to be interested in any of that, because they got to think about what they actually need to do that day or that night. And so thankfully, there's some really great organizations who have just, they're already been there and already been present, trying to reach out, bring a safe place for undocumented immigrants to, get the care that they need, but then even done like more and more work, but having to do it in a way that is going to be safe for their workers and their employees, right? And so that is, again, this ongoing kind of, okay, we have to figure out ways to be innovative in a time in which, it's really pushing us to do so. And I think that there's a lot of great organizations, I think, that are making that their platform, that they've always served the immigrant, community in general, especially those who have been undocumented. And now they've even just gone, 10 times harder. And just seeing that kind of wherewithal, but also just that, really pushing hard work ethic kind of space is a really exciting, because it's like, yeah, I feel like we're doing something. Like this is helping. People are actually saying like, I learned about this through this thing, and now I've told my other family and friends, and now they know. And at the end of the day, it's all about word of mouth. What do you know? Where do you go? And are you going to get what people say you're supposed to be getting, right? Because too often people are let down, that you're supposed to get this kind of access or this kind of care, and they're met with prejudice, discrimination, sheer just shutting of the door in their face, and that too many times over just really does cause a lot of disheartened feelings and a lot of, just general, I don't believe you, mistrust. We know that there's a huge issue with mistrust when it comes to people and healthcare providers. And I'm talking as a healthcare provider. So like, I'm not, no shade on healthcare providers, because I am one, but like there are too many things that have happened, especially depending on a community, that they're going to not see a otherwise, resourceful location that could be resourceful, but they're not going to see it as that. They're going to see it as a threat, because, this is what they've done to our community in the past. Thankfully, I think like I'm in a space where we're really trying to turn that around. I'm surrounded by a lot of community engaged interest and folks, and a lot of like, I don't see hierarchy. I'm not interested in that. Like when I'm talking to you, you're my person. I am at your level. There is no, like, I have a PhD or not. Like, I don't care about that. It helps me get where I wanted to get to, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really do me any help if I'm not actually hearing what the person is telling me they need.
Yeah, I think that's great. We have so many interested students asking questions, so I want to turn it over to those questions. And one of them is actually probably several of them, but this one is closely related to what you were just talking about. So a great question for Dr. López: what measures can local governments without people of color representation take to address cultural aversion to going to the doctor? And I think this relates to what you're talking about that previous mistrust and those sorts of things.
Yeah, so the question is, what can local government do who may have a more homogeneous setup? Got it. All right, yeah, so one of the things I think is going to be really imperative is understanding implicit bias. And, implicit bias is everywhere. Even someone like myself who teaches like an anti-oppression course on all the isms, like we all have them in an implicit bias, something that we react to because social, how we grow up in our place, wherever that was, the dynamics of our family, the dynamics of our social systems has decided that this person who represents this equates to that, right? This kind of understanding of, when you see like a Latin person, you think, oh, they're taking away my job, right? This kind of connection that doesn't have really any underpinning, like that's not actually shown, like doesn't shake out in statistics, doesn't shake out in economics. Rather, the reason why we have, the robust agriculture that we have is because of the backs and hard work of immigrants, specifically, and most of them being from Central and South America and Mexico, right? And so when we're thinking about, what we're saying is, and being able to pay attention to how much that's going to influence who we see, how we see them, and therefore what kinds of policies we're going to make out of them. I teach this policy class and I say, for every policy that's made, it always starts with the individualistic lens, because the US and the development of these policies comes from individualism. And that in of itself is a problem, because if we see it only as this only going to be impacting us or how it can put us forward, then inherently we're causing even more of a disproportion in the work of others. And so I think implicit bias is an important factor. I think an active movement to say diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It's not enough to say we're looking for diverse persons. I don't know what you mean by that. Like who do you mean by you say diverse? Most of the time people equate diverse to race, which is fine. But diversity also includes lots of other things. So, okay, so we're talking race, ethnicity, we're talking about, what else are we talking about here? Gender, sexual orientation, are we talking about ableism, right? Like, what are we talking about when we're saying diverse? And is that really enough? No, inclusion is that second part. Cultural humility, not cultural competence. Not that I know that you speak Spanish and that's as far as I need to know, but rather that I am forever ongoing learning something about a person's culture through the work that I do. And that plays a role not only in healthcare, which is where I do a lot of my work in, but it does play a role in local government. If we do not make note about what it is to be diverse and inclusive, and then to also see that representative in the policies that are being made, then we're really going to be missing out a whole ton, and it's not going to change anything. And so recently in St. Louis, there was a huge election, and from a state perspective too, but St. Louis City, which is where I live, was very big because there were, some big folks who were getting there was like a movement of more progressive Black women specifically from a state level and a city and municipality level. And that was really, really like a historic kind of situation that happened, which is showing that people are wanting something different, that they're wanting to get the voices of people who are the majority in a given city area, you know, to also be sitting in those platforms, which I think is only appropriate. You know, no, can one Latina talk about all Latin people? No, I cannot, you know, even though people will want me to. But like, will I at least, can I have the cultural humility to understand variations of the culture and have that be a part of my process and learning? Absolutely. So I think that at that bare minimum is what we should be expecting our local lawmakers to be doing. And if they can't even reach that bare minimum, then we have, you know, there needs to be a changeover in that space.
Yeah, I think that leads really well into this next question. And I'm also in the city and was really jazzed about that recent election as well. So this question is about how during this pandemic, and I think also just in this moment, Americans, so I think people in the US are starting to participate in discussions or realizing the compounding intersectionality of all of these issues. Things like racism, ethnic disparities, healthcare. How much can be done simultaneously? So to what extent can corona responses involve nuance to begin addressing these other issues?
That's a good question. I think
it's a great question.
I know, I was like, excellent. I actually think that there's a lot of opportunity. I say like, this is a horrible time in our history, like horrible. I mean, it's depressing, and there's a lot of heartache and sadness, and there's just so much going on. And so, when you're just talking about COVID and the impact of COVID on a family, you know, in general, and then, you know, then you put in all of these structural inequities and how then that's influencing everything. It's kind of saying, can we really turn another blind eye to this? Is this how we want to represent ourselves in a place where, you know, there's supposed to be equitable access to things when we know that there isn't, and people have been talking about how there hasn't been for decades, you know, and so now this is making it even more apparent that it's not. And so I think that this is an opportunity, right, in which I think that things that have always needed to be kind of retuned, fixed up, changed, you know, eliminated, start from scratch, start all over kind of situation, that this is the time to do it, because this is where we are saying, yes, more people are in need and are dying because they are not able to get the care that they need. And we cannot just keep doing what we have always been doing, because obviously that's not working, and it hasn't been working. And this is showing it even more clearly that it's not. And so I think that this is opportunity that we can't let up. And I think for that reason, organizations that I see on the ground, you know, in the area have really been taking up arms and really making that stride and pushing those things, and really making that, you know, pushing other bigger entities who are a little bit more slow to change, who are, you know, more hesitant, there's more bureaucracy, whatever the reason that it may be, you know, that they're kind of pushing them too and saying like, listen, this can't be how we keep doing this, because people are dying out there because they can't get the bare necessities of what they need. And that's not something that we can keep, you know, that can keep going this way, because the pandemic is COVID is not just going to go away. And so we have to think about, what are we going to do to really change the dynamics and accessibility to all the things, not only healthcare, because in my mind, I think mostly healthcare, but obviously housing, education, right? Like just these like very clear cut, like to food accessibility, right? All of these things, transportation, like that, we can't just keep saying, well, good luck to you, you know? And I think that if we keep going down, and I've seen some really awesome work being done in which there has been shifts and changes there, which makes me excited to see like, okay, yeah, we're taking on this and also saying we need to shift all of, you know, be starting to shift these things more appropriately.
Yeah, so true. So there's a couple questions about trying to understand how language barriers might be causing particular problems for Spanish-speaking communities. And I guess trying to understand not, I mean, I guess the obvious answer is like, yes, language barriers cause issues, but the questions are about to what extent do we know if how much those language barriers are adding to the current situation, the current numbers, those sorts of things, as opposed to other roadblocks to getting care.
Sure.
Yeah.
Factors.
And, yeah. And how do you kind of try and figure out like what factors are affecting these outcomes?
Mm-hmm. So actually that one study that I was talking about, who just came out, some of the main factors, usually we think about factors to COVID, what adds to the to severity are often like predisposing health indicators, which there was one, heart disease, to that. So and not to say that those things don't matter, like if you have asthma, that it won't like influence it, but that it wasn't those weren't the major factors. Major factors were your workplace, especially those who work in agriculture and in meat packing industries. Also your environment, meaning your like ambient air quality. We know that those who live in lower socioeconomic status, those who live in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods also have higher higher air pollution issues, have also higher lead problems, right? Children who are who are going to be impacted by lead have more likelihood of having behavioral health issues, having behavioral problems in school, because lead influences development. And so development is then going to influence how you're going to act, right? Air quality, air pollution, that's how it's highly linked to asthma, which is why we see asthma as being a high factor for those who are in lower socioeconomic status in neighborhood depictions, right? Same idea with this. The study also noted that those who are monolingual, meaning just Spanish, had 2 times higher likelihood of being infected or dying from COVID than those who weren't. And so that's a big deal, right? That's saying we're not just talking about heart disease. We're not just talking about air pollution, poverty, things that we do know, but are even being more highlighted. But we're also talking about language. And so that language, although we talk about it often and we all can be aware that it is like problematic, just like anything else, right? Like, yes, you're more likely to have diabetes if you're, overweight. Yes, we all kind of know that, right? But, it doesn't really, it's like, is there more to it? And the thing is that monolingual folks, especially Spanish speakers, the sheer difficulty in just being able to get your basic pieces like put together can be so difficult, can be so disheartening that folks just kind of give up because they think, how am I even going to get around to this? Or they've been shut down so often that it's like, where am I even going to go next? Because I feel like I've gone to all the places I could go to, right? And that's the things that I keep hearing from folks that they keep telling me. They're like, I don't know what else to do. I feel like I have used all of my options, or all my options have been used up, and now I can't go back to number 1 over here because I've already gone to number 1 3 times, right? And so like I can't go to that resource over and over again. And it's kind of saying, is like, where does that come from? Like where is that thought of not being able to tap into that resource again come from? And it has a lot to do with, the shame, the shame of what maybe someone told you the last time you went to go get that resource and said like, well, you can't come back again, making you feel as though you weren't worthy to get what it is that you most, the necessary things that you needed. It also comes from, I went there and I was really confused. And since I was so confused because nobody could really understand, or I couldn't understand what was really happening, I just decided to leave instead, right? Instead of just having at least one person who maybe is in that resource, who maybe doesn't know Spanish to, its complete fluency, but could at least make some connections here and there for the person to be able to get what they need. More often than not, what we're looking for, what folks are interested in, is just to be able to lean into someone just even for a couple minutes so that they can get out what they need, and in hopes of it coming back to them with what they actually are in necessity for. And it's so simple. You don't need much, and people are super grateful. And that's the thing. I think people experience, like think that once you want something, you want to take and take and take. And I think that that's a really unfortunate way to think about people. I think that, yeah, if you've been resource limited for the majority of your life, and you find something that's going to be helpful and you want to take as much of that as you can, would you really blame anyone? Like, I wouldn't. Like, if this is the time I can get it, I'm going to try to get as much as I can out of it, because how I don't know what the next days will look like, the next month will look like. So I think we need to really take a step back in how we judge people and what they're doing and how they're going about, what it is, the resources that they need. And you really need to like, and that really does also come down to, how do they look? Do they speak English? Is that somehow, how does that play a part in how you then see them? Would it be different if the person looked different, spoke differently, acted differently? And I think that if you say to me that it wouldn't, I would say to you, that's probably inaccurate, and that you need to rethink that.
Absolutely. So this has all been amazing. I could talk to you all day long, but we need to wrap up here in the next 2 minutes or so. So what I want to ask you is, we have 1,300 people involved with this course. And so with that large audience, what is it that you want us to know? What are the important, you've given us a ton of important messages, but like if you had to say, here's a way you could help, or here's a really important change that you could make, or something like that, what are your words of wisdom for us here as we finish out the hour?
Absolutely. I think at the very bare minimum, what we all need to be doing when we step outside our, place of residence is think, how am I interpreting the world around me? And is at some point while I'm interpreting, am I somehow pushing on a prejudice, upon someone else, that just because of something that they say, look, or what they wear? And that, that's fine to have had that thought, right? I'm not saying be ashamed of that thought. I'm saying notice it, take it in, reflect on it, and consider thinking about it differently next time. That this is how we actually make movement, that this is how we actually make change. If you are comfortable in the space that you're in and you don't move into the uncomfortable space, then you will always kind of be blindsided by the impacts of other people's lives. And, I guess you could not care about other people's lives, but I think that to some degree, we're all going to be influenced somehow, right? May it be through human capital of others. There are so many things that people bring to the table that are unfortunately left on the table because of prejudice and discrimination and racism and structural inequities on varying levels. And so if there is a place that you can, even do your small part, then that part still is relevant. That part still does matter. And that it's going to make a difference, even if it's not something that you see happening, on a macro level.
Absolutely.
And I think that is, at the bare minimum, what we can all do, and you don't need a degree for that, right? It's just human kind of humility and thinking about, your own bias, thinking about what kinds of things that you've experienced from your own identities, your intersecting of your identities, and that how sometimes that can, also play out in the way that you see other people.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. This has been really amazing. You've given us so much to think about. I'm going to share in our Canvas page where we have additional resources, I'll share the article that you sent me that you've referenced a few times in this conversation so that everyone can see it. I know the students had literally hundreds more questions to ask you, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get through them all, but I think you've given us a ton to think about, and I just want to thank you so very much. This has been incredible. Good luck with all of your work, and thank you. So this is the end of our first class session. We'll be back here again tomorrow at 1 o'clock, starting promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Dr. López. And everyone have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.